Please be seated. Usually I start off thanking the choir for singing so beautifully, which they do all the time. So I'm always very thankful for that, to have such great quality music is such a hallmark of the Episcopal Church. Today, however, it was so wonderful to hear you all singing the last verse of that hymn, as I could hear you all from here. So thank you for all your singing. It was nice to have kind of stereo sound of both the choir and you all with singing and lifting your hearts to God there. Title of my message this morning is Living Stones, and it comes from the epistle reading from 1 Peter chapter 2. I want to start by telling you, this is an old, perhaps familiar story to some of you all. There was a man standing aside a cliff. And let's make it a modern story. So he was taking a selfie. And over he goes. He slips, he falls, and just as he's gaining momentum, he reaches an arm out and he latches onto a tree branch, and it arrests his fall. But he's hanging there from the branch, can't get up, and he looks down, and it's 1,000 feet below. So he begins to yell, "Help, help," over and over again. But no help comes. He gets desperate, yells some more, and as he begins to lose hope, finally he hears a voice. "John, it's me." He says, I can hear you, but where are you? Who are you?" "John, it's me, God. I'm here to help." "Oh, thank God. Thank you. If you help me, I will be good for the rest of my life. I will help the poor any chance anyone needs anything from me. I promise if you help me, I'll be good always." God said, "Well, that's great, John. I need you to do one thing." "Oh, God, anything. I promise I will do anything." "Let go." There was a long pause. Then John yelled, "Help! Is there anyone else up there?" In our spiritual lives, letting go can be very challenging. Letting go and trusting God perhaps is the most challenging endeavor that we have as Christians. Why is that? Letting go of our wants and desires and purposes so that God can build us into a spiritual house is nothing new in human existence. In fact, these challenges, the challenge of letting go and letting God build us, go all the way back in human history. The Hebrew Scriptures are full of examples. In Genesis, we see it for the first time. Adam and Eve disobeyed God's command. They followed their desire. They ate the fruit. When we read Cain and Abel, there it is again. We see it in the Tower of Babel and in the flood. Later, it's there when Jonah rails against God's call for him to save the city of Nineveh. He wants his own way, not God's way. Over and over, the prophets call the Israelites to let go and let God build them. These days, people struggle with the same spiritual challenge. There are several reasons why. First, letting go involves changing behavior. Harvard psychologist Howard Gardner writes, "Minds are hard to change." He's not talking about decisions like upgrading our phones or figuring out which restaurant to eat at. He's referring to behavior. A change in mindset that results in a new behavior is tough. It's hard work. Why? Well, for one, we like what we like. It's a big deal to start dieting or exercise. Equally, it's a big deal to stop dieting and exercising if we do it too much. Our behaviors become familiar to us. Our behaviors give us familiar outcomes. They're like wearing that old favorite sweater or sweatshirt that we just wear so much. We also resist change because we may be afraid of what's next. Acting the way we do is comforting to us. If we change, then what? What will become of us? Our behaviors give us meaning. If we beat ourselves up all the time, we do so in part because it feeds us. It gives us purpose. It's the same with hate and anger. Some people hold grudges and resentments for years. What does it get them? Well, for one, it gives them a purpose to their life. These negative thoughts carry them through their days. Here's another challenge. If we let go of shame, resentment, hatred, pride, and disdain, we will be different. We will change. Will people still like us? Will we still like ourselves if we change that much? This morning's reading from Peter helps. He instructs us to see ourselves differently. He tells us to rid ourselves of negative emotions that hold us hostage so that we may become living stones. That ridding portion is not in our reading this morning. The Revised Common Lectionary sometimes places us in awkward positions in the reading, and this is an example of one. We missed the first verse of 1 Peter chapter 2. So let me read it to you. It reads, "Rid yourself therefore of all malice, all guile, insincerity, envy, and slander." That changes things, doesn't it? With the addition of that first verse, the reading makes more sense. We need to rid ourselves of negative thoughts, emotions, and feelings, and once that is done, we may long for the goodness of God. Once we've stirred up the longing for God's goodness, which is what Peter's referring to as pure spiritual milk, that metaphor he's using there, we may come to God. Then Peter advises us, like living stones, let ourselves be built into a spiritual house. We must let go of our emotional and spiritual junk to long for God. That has to happen first before we long to be with God. We feel that longing growing in us, stirring our hearts and shaking our souls. We must come to God. Peter tells us that once we are freed from darkness, we can be with God. The heart of Peter's message this morning is that we must let go to let God work. How do we understand God's work in our lives? When I was in high school one summer, I worked as a mason's helper. I brought him stones, I mixed the mortar, I carried both up the scaffolding. Then the mason looked at the stone. He weighed it in his hand. He chiseled it to approximate size, then laid it in the wall among the other stones. He lifted it again in his hand and chiseled it to its final shape. He added mortar to its sides and then laid it back into its spot. Then the mason leveled it and added more mortar. He tapped it a few times. He repeated the process over and over again. When we let go of negative emotions, we become the stone in the divine mason's hand. When we rid ourselves of injustice, malice, deception, insincerity, evil, and slander, God plucks us from the pile. He taps away the protrusions and deformities that have encrusted themselves on our souls. He weighs the goodness in us. Then he places us among the other stones, those being the people who sit amongst you every Sunday. And we become alive. We are the living stones. What happens to us when we let God build us? Our faith grows. Our trust in God grows. Hope and love grow in us. Fear melts away. Guilt and shame retreat. Our pridefulness abates. When we become living stones, we don't fear the unknown. Friends of mine once told me how they became living stones, how they let God work them. They left the jobs they hated. They retooled and adjusted their work. She became a hospice nurse, and he found ways to help people using his skills in marketing and advertising. When they let God build them, they discovered a joy that they never could have anticipated. In the divine mason's hands, we are formed into the living stones that are the church. More than our majestic, magnificent buildings, living stones are the true church. Stone by stone, we become the sanctuary that draw others to God. Row by row, we become the steeple that leads others out of the darkness and into God's marvelous light.